Quyen Nguyen-Hoang is a writer, translator, and art curator born in Vietnam. Her poems and translations have appeared in Poetry magazine, Jacket 2, The Margins, and various literary anthologies. She is a Stanford University graduate, a 2020 Heim Translation grant recipient, and a winner of the Winter-Spring 2022 Gabo Prize for Literature in Translation. She is pursuing a PhD at Stanford University. The novel Chronicles of a Village is set in an anonymous Vietnamese village based on the author's personal memories. Written in vibrant fragments that resemble prose poems, the novel combines the author's melodious style of oral storytelling with historical micro-narratives and mythological elements. The book takes the reader through ancient legends, love stories, nature, war tragedies, and modern alienation, which constitute the beauty and the fatal historical disabilities of a land. In this episode, Quyên spoke about her rendition of Chronicles of a Village, translated from Vietnamese, written by one of the most prominent writers, Nguyen Thanh Hien. You may give the feedback on this episode using the link given in the show notes or through the Spotify app. Quyên, welcome to our podcast, Harshnayam. Thank you for coming over.
Thank you for having me.
You are a writer, translator, and curator. Tell us about your art curation, and do writing and curation influence each other at any time?
Curation. I think writing and curation for me, the thing that they have in common is that maybe they're practices that sharpen my intuition for the kind of art and literature and ways of being that I like and that I want to embody in the world. So in Vietnam, when I work as the curator, usually at galleries or art organizations, in Saigon, or Hanoi, I think I find it most meaningful when I curate my close friends' artworks of all kinds of media. And also, of course, works by artists that I like, usually in Vietnam or Southeast Asia. And there are works that move me in a very strong and often quite uncanny way. And there are not that many of them, really. I'm quite picky when I curate the artworks that I want to show. And it's very similar with my writing and translating. I try to be quite careful about the kind of questions I want to write into or the kind of authors or texts that I want to translate. So ideally, I want to let these works come to me and choose me and move me. And of course, eventually change me somehow.
Good translators are good curators of literature, I feel. You curate the work for us.
I hope so.
What drew you to literature?
My mother was a great reader, and so was her father. So my maternal grandfather, who was an editor at a revolutionary publishing press in Vietnam during the war in Hanoi. And there was a shortage of books and, of course, everything else because it was wartime. But this publishing house, aside from its store of all kinds of Marxist, Leninist documents, they had a great library. So my mother was able to have access to a lot of great books. And I think by the time she was a teenager, she had read all of the great Chinese and Russian novels that she could find there in Vietnamese translation, of course. So she naturally gave me a lot of books when I was a child. And she studied Japanese, in translation in college. And my grandfather also, translated some literature while I was working as an editor. So we're just a family of geeks, I suppose, and who have a lot of love for literature and language.
Which is your first work in translation, published work of translation? And how did you get into translation?
I think one of the first short stories I translated and got published was called A Dream by Dương Nghĩa Mậu, who's a great 20th century Vietnamese writer. And it was commissioned by a friend of mine for a magazine called Words Without Borders. Wonderful magazine for those who love translation. So I started out translating mostly short poems, either of mine or, my friends, or, writers in the Vietnamese literary canon, or short stories. And Chronicles of a Village was my first translation in book form.
Can you tell us about your favorite authors?
I really love the work of Nhã Thuyên, who's a friend and teacher of mine. And she's an excellent contemporary Vietnamese poet, working mostly in Vietnamese. But gosh, her Vietnamese is so beautiful and careful and loving and nurturing. And it's the kind of Vietnamese that carries and hides also a lot of pain with a lot of delicacy. So I admire her work a lot. And she also has a very deep and piercing understanding of how important translation is, because she translates English language literature into Vietnamese. A lot of writers in Vietnam actually do. As a country, there's a great readership for international literature. So, and my friend, Thuyen, who writes in Vietnamese, usually has her work translated into English by a very wonderful translator called Caitlin Rees, who's now based in New York, who works very closely with her. So, Thuyen and Caitlin are, I think, a wonderful writer-translator duo. They're both great friends of mine, and I read their works with so much love and admiration.
So you mean to say the translations from Vietnamese to English, it's very vibrant. There are a lot of translations are going on right now from Vietnamese to English.
I think there are more and more translations from Vietnamese into English now, but I think the number is still quite low, of course. As I mentioned to you, a lot of world literature gets translated into Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese market is full of, non-Vietnamese literature translated into Vietnamese. But because of the dynamics of the market, in the world literature scene, there's not been a lot of Vietnamese literature translated into English. But I think that's going to change soon.
So are there any small presses which are focusing on Vietnamese to English literature, either back in Vietnam or in USA?
The scene that I know best is in Vietnam, because that's where I'm based. There's a press called Ajar Press, run by, again, Nhã Thuyên, this writer that I've mentioned a few times in this podcast so far. So she and Caitlin, her translator, co-run this small independent press in Vietnam, and they translate and publish a lot of contemporary Vietnamese poets and writers from Vietnamese into English. And it's really a labor of love, because they don't earn any money from this kind of work. And I really admire the endurance and persistence that they have to do this kind of work.
Now, the author of this particular novel, The Chronicles of Village, Nguyen Tan Han, could you talk about his work in detail?
He's quite an introverted writer, so that's why it's a bit hard to find his bio online, I suppose. But he's very incredibly prolific, and as you saw online, he's written a lot of novels and poems and epic poems. And he's also done a lot of translation from English into Vietnamese. So for those who don't know, he's a contemporary Vietnamese writer, based in Vietnam, has lived his whole life in Vietnam. He was born in 1940s, so really he belongs to my grandparents' generation, actually. And he works mostly as a novelist and poet. And his work is considered quite experimental in Vietnam, so it has difficulty getting published. So actually, he self-publishes all of his works in Vietnamese on his website, and he makes everything accessible and free for everyone, which I think is quite a remarkable act, especially in a day and age when a lot of artistic and literary works are so easily and quickly, commodified and packaged into a product so that it accrues value. But this author, he's really quite a gem because he just shares everything that he writes on his website for free, and he welcomes all kinds of readers.
We have a writer in Tamil, one great writer we have. World-class writer, in my opinion, one Mr. J. Mohan. He does the same, and he's a prolific writer. He wrote one 25,000-page novel,
Wow.
and only recently his works they started getting translated into English now. So one of them, Stories of the True, is longlisted for Alta Award recently. So he distributes his work freely online.
Very similar.
What of all his body of work, why did you choose this particular novel to translate?
Well, like most of my translations, the work came to me really. I didn't really choose it. So a friend of mine connected me to the author. And it was actually one of his students who suggested that I translate this particular work just because he had just finished it at the time and it was the most fresh. So I read it in manuscript and I liked it. And I had just graduated from college at the time and having nothing better to do, I just went ahead and translated the whole thing without a publishing contract or any slightest idea about, the publishing process. I never, knew that one could even have a career out of doing this. So it really came to me, and I'm glad that it's now shared with readers beyond my small circle. But it was just a kind of a passion project.
Now, how did it get published then?
Again, through friends. I think Penguin Southeast Asia was getting set up a few years ago, and they were just seeking writers and translators who would fit their portfolio, I suppose. And so a friend of mine just connected me to the editor. So they read the translation manuscript and liked it and took a chance on it, which I'm really grateful for. So I guess the key is just to be connected to friends who have these connections, because I really was an outsider in the literary industry and marketplace. I was just kind of winging it as I went along.
Okay. Now coming to the novel, what we get in India about Vietnam is through Hollywood films mostly.
Right.
When you come to this particular novel, there are a lot of references to some historical and political events. Right? For example, he talks about French colonialism and the dynasty rule, even influence of communism. Can you brief us about these events that occurred in chronologically?
A very brief and bare sketch, I suppose. So a lot of Vietnamese would tell you that the Vietnamese belong to the northern rule, as in the Chinese imperialist rule, for 1,000 years. So that's roughly the first millennium after AD, I suppose. So that's kind of the significant part of our history. And of course, there's the 100 years of French colonialism between the 19th and 20th century, followed by the American War. or the Vietnam War, as it's known in English. And of course, throughout the years, there are so many internal struggles between different rules and political parties and dynasties and ideologies. And of course, there's the famous rise of communism in the 20th century. And all of these are briefly touched on in Chronicles of a Village, but usually in a fleeting or subtle way, I suppose. Nguyễn Thanh Hiển is the kind of author who can be quite direct in his political commentary or critiques, but not in this work. And I think I especially liked Chronicles of a Village when I first read it, because it has this sort of background, this undercurrent of political pain and heaviness. But then it's also about so many other things like love stories and fables and mythologies.
You have different chapters in the novel. If the reader wants, each chapter can be read as a separate short story.
So the structure that you mentioned, perhaps a kind of structureless structure, I would say, I think comes quite naturally to the author, actually, because he, if you follow his Facebook, he's no longer now quite active, but he used to post every day his writings on his Facebook. And each day the post would resemble a lot these fragments that you see in Chronicles of a Village. So every day he sort of has his, own reflection put together into a kind of fragmentary piece of writing. And over time, they just sort of connect, because it came out of him. The coherence of the internal coherence of the author comes through. And I think he unconsciously did it, but I think he also deliberately performs this kind of writing because he wants to make, his own form of the novel. So as you mentioned, the novel is usually defined by Western norms of narrative, I suppose. Like, you have chapters, you have very linear plot lines, you have very sharp, well-contoured characters. And I think he wanted to subvert some of that. So he just wrote the way that he thought and spoke every day. So when you read his book, there's a very clear quality of oral literature. It really sounds like a man telling you about his life in an almost casual and unrefined way, but actually still very delicate and refined in an unrefined way, I guess. What seems like a lot of digressions or just random anecdotes. So there's no kind of clear plot or, immense realist descriptions like you would see in a Euro-American novel. But I liked it. It has a quality of freedom, I think.
Now, the prose in the novel in many places, it's very poetic actually. It sounds like poetry. You also have done a lot of translation work, which is involving poetry.
I think for me, the strongest moments in Nguyễn Thanh Hiển work are his poetic turns of language. Some of his unfinished sentences could be so full of lightness and romance, and also such a deep and visceral connection to the earth and also the sky and all these godly and mundane forces that govern our lives. His writings really embody this way of mythological, or I guess mythopoetic thinking that I really cherish. It definitely references real historical facts and figures and documents, but then a lot of references are also entirely fictional. And so his writing is a kind of, I think, being in the world that's always suspended, as you say, between dream and reality, between the real and the surreal, between the historical and the fabled between the living and the dead. All of these mixed voices are always floating in the atmosphere. And I think it's a beautiful way of being to be able to navigate all of these oppositional forces. And personally, I just gravitate towards poetry. Don't know why. I write it sometimes, or I write things that are eventually called poetry sometimes. And I like to translate Vietnamese poetry whenever I have the capacity and capaciousness of mind to do it.
How many days it took you to finish this translation?
My process is usually to get the first draft done quite quickly. I just want to have something like a rough block of sculpture to work with. So the first draft took me maybe only a couple of months. And I just worked, on and off, like not really consistently. But then the revision took years, really. And then I also kind of forgot about the manuscript for a while until one day, my friend connected me to the publisher, Penguin Southeast Asia, and I began again to do another like 10 sets of revisions. So for me, it's the revision that's the more arduous and time consuming process. And that can definitely take years.
One recurring theme in the novel, the author keeps talking about rice and fabric.
Yes. So rice and fabric is a literal, really translation of the term cơm áo in Vietnamese. So cơm is rice and áo is garments or the things you wear, a shirt, for example. And rice and fabric worries are a kind of idiomatic phrase in Vietnamese that mean the kind of practical concerns like bills or economic gains and losses in our everyday life, how to financially support your family, let's say quotidian maintenances, basically all kinds of numerical and quantitative abstractions around money that one has to take care of. And in the novel, this term rice and fabric worry refers particularly to the common worry that farmers have to deal with, like how their crops are doing, how the harvest turns out this year, how long the rain or the dry season is going to last. Will my family have enough rice to eat this week? Will my children have new shirts to wear for the new school year? Things like that. And these mentions in the book, I think, are important because they remind us not to romanticize the life of peasants and poets, because these very intimate and very intense worries are there all the time.
In the afterword, you mentioned the scent of the original and bringing it into translation. A tonality, I understand, in a particular translation, bringing the same tonality and voices of each characters, I understand. What exactly is the scent that you mentioned about?
I wanted to think of language and translation as an atmospheric zone, hence the idea of a scent. So an emotional and atmospheric zone, and also a zone of the senses. So language and translation and words really are just a kind of air that you take in with your inhalation, with your senses, and not just with your eyes and your intellect. And of course, it's very impossible to replicate a perfume, a scent, uh, in a new language. A Vietnamese perfume can never be repeated as an English language aroma. The translation is all about trying to do this difficult thing of recreating something that you smell somewhere and then recreating it and remaking it as a new flavor, a new presence in a new tongue.
Nativity, the word, can that be a close approximation of scent that you're talking about?
I think that depends on the reader. I think if that's the effect that you feel, perhaps. But I think, nativity or foreignness, it's really subjective. Something that feels native to someone can feel completely alien to someone else. And things can be quite, native and unnative at the same time. So I hesitate to say that a scent or a perfume or an aroma can represent the nativity of a place. But you're correct in saying that some things that define the essence of a person or land, or the indigeneity of an object, a being. Sometimes it's just a scent. It's just a kind of energy or an atmosphere. And that's the hardest thing to translate because it's so ineffable.
Right.
It's so hard to put into words.
Do you have any preference for the kind of work that you want to take up in the future for translations, in terms of themes or in terms of structure?
Again, I try to let the works come to me, either through friends, recommendations, or just pure chance, I guess. So I try not to have a prescribed set of preferences or expectations, but definitely I think something that carries poetry for sure. But in what form, I don't know. I try not to know.
You try not to know. That's an interesting answer. Now, finally, what are the projects that you're currently working on? And with your PhD and all that, will you have time to work on translations at all?
Yeah, that's the question for me right now because I have so many obligations with the university. But again, when I have the largeness of mind to take on translation, I try to do it. I'm working on a collection by Han Mak Tu, who was a Vietnamese Catholic poet, and an almost unbearably romantic one. And I think he wrote some of the most gorgeous pieces of Vietnamese modern poetry in the 20th century. And it's very hard to translate, but it keeps my soul alive. So I return to my manuscript whenever I can to get a fresh flow of vitality, I suppose. I also have a collection of my own writings that I'm always working on when I'm, when I can't deal with my PhD requirements anymore. So they're all kind of in poet at the moment, but they're really important to me. So we'll see what happens with these pieces of writings. They might never be published, but that's all right. I think poetry keeps me alive, and that's the greatest gift already.
Okay, all the best for your future and for your PhD and your translations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.